Elizabeth had always loved working at the old hotel. The creaking floors and dim lighting gave it a certain charm that she found comforting. She had been the receptionist for over a decade, and in that time, she had seen all kinds of guests come and go. But tonight was different. Tonight, the hotel was nearly empty, with only a handful of guests scattered throughout the rooms. As the night wore on, Elizabeth began to feel uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she glanced up from her computer screen, she felt as though someone was standing behind her, their breath hot on her neck. But every time she turned around, there was no one there. Finally, Elizabeth decided to take a break and go for a walk. She needed to clear her head and get some fresh air. As she made her way down the darkened hallway, she heard a sound coming from one of the rooms. It was a soft, muffled sobbing. Elizabeth hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should she knock on the door and offer to help? Or should she ignore it and continue on her walk? In the end, curiosity won out, and Elizabeth knocked on the door. There was no answer, but she could still hear the crying. Slowly, she pushed the door open, peering into the dimly lit room. At first, she couldn't see anything, but then her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she saw a figure huddled on the bed. "Are you okay?" Elizabeth asked, taking a step forward. The figure didn't move, but the crying grew louder. Elizabeth took another step, then another, until she was standing right beside the bed. She reached out to touch the person's shoulder, but her hand went straight through the figure. Elizabeth stumbled back, her heart racing. She knew then that something was very wrong with the hotel. But she didn't know just how wrong until later that night. As she sat at her desk, filling out paperwork, Elizabeth heard a sound coming from the lobby. It was a low, guttural growl, like an animal in pain. Elizabeth tensed, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She listened, waiting for the sound to go away, but it only grew louder. Slowly, she stood up, her eyes scanning the lobby. She saw nothing at first, but then movement caught her eye. It was a figure, slinking through the shadows. It was too dark to make out any details, but Elizabeth could tell it was not human. As the figure drew closer, Elizabeth could see that it was covered in fur, with long, sharp claws and glowing red eyes. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The creature stalked closer, its growls becoming louder and more menacing. Elizabeth could feel its hot breath on her face. She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable attack. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature vanished. Elizabeth was left standing alone in the lobby, trembling with fear. For the rest of the night, Elizabeth sat at her desk, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The hotel was silent, as though the creature had never been there at all. As the sun rose and the first light of day filtered through the windows, Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief. She had made it through the night, but she knew she could never go back to the hotel again. As she gathered her things and headed for the door, Elizabeth heard a sound behind her. It was a soft, mournful sigh, like a ghostly whisper. She turned around, but there was no one there. Suddenly, Elizabeth felt a cold breeze blow past her, even though the door was closed. She shivered and hurried out of the hotel, not looking back. She never returned to work there again. Months later, Elizabeth received a call from the police. They had found the body of a man in one of the hotel rooms. He had been brutally attacked, torn apart by some kind of animal. The police had no leads, no suspects, and no explanation for what had happened. Elizabeth was horrified by the news. She knew then that the creature she had seen that night was responsible for the man's death. She wondered how many other victims the creature had claimed over the years. As the days passed, Elizabeth began to feel as though she was being watched once again. She could feel the creature's presence in the shadows, lurking just out of sight. She knew that it was only a matter of time before it came for her. One night, as Elizabeth was walking home from work, she heard the creature's growls once again. She quickened her pace, hoping to outrun it. But it was no use. The creature was too fast, too powerful. Just as she thought it was about to pounce, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was an old man, dressed in tattered robes. He held a staff in one hand and a silver amulet in the other. "Be gone, demon," the old man shouted, holding up the amulet. To Elizabeth's amazement, the creature snarled and backed away. It slunk off into the darkness, disappearing from sight. The old man turned to Elizabeth, his eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft and kind. Elizabeth stared at him, unsure of what to say. She didn't know who he was or where he had come from, but she was grateful for his help. As the old man disappeared back into the shadows, Elizabeth realized that the hotel was cursed. It was haunted by dark forces that no one could explain. And she knew that she would never be the same again. From that day forward, she would always be on the lookout for the things that go bump in the night.